at another topic, one that's got quite a lot of overlap with what you've already done with Miss Williams when you studied the Great Turn. It's going to build a little bit on what you learnt last lesson from me as well. But we're going to make a start, just like we always do, with a knowledge retrieval quiz. So if you can open up the document attached to Google Drive, attached to Google Classroom. At the top of it, you've got the starter quiz. If you could pause the video now, have a go at the starter quiz. It's the same one as last lesson, so let's see if you can beat your score. Pause the video and have a go at the starter quiz. Excellent. So, really quickly, let's go through the answers. So, number 1, Lenin died in 1924. 2, 1920 to 22. 3 is the Doomvirate. 4, Alexei Rykov. 5, Mikhail Tomsky. 6, Lev Kamenev. 7, the Kronstadt Rising of 1921. 8 is the Gosplan. And 9, the Treaty of Rapallo from 1922. Make sure all your corrections are done in green. And then we can now start today's lesson. Now what I'd like you to do is, this video I think is only going to last between 20 and 30 minutes. It's not going to be a very long one, this. And I'd like to make sure I've got your full attention. So if you have got your phone out in front of you, if it is there tempting to get your attention, please go stick it in another room or put it somewhere where you can't see it. I've just done it with mine. And then make sure you've got access to watch this video and fill in that document at the same time. So if you want to play this YouTube video on a tablet or a television, that might be easier, and then you can directly type in to the document. As well, if you'd rather watch this video and do your notes on paper, you can do that. At the end of it, just take a picture of it and submit it in Google Classroom in the same way you would another document. That's absolutely fine. You can take your notes however is best for you. Now, the thing we're going to look at today is this question here. How successful was Stalin's policy of forced collectivization between 1929 and 1941? As always, we're going to start with that what do you already know, thinking back to those lessons about the Great Turn. On the Word document, or the Google Sheets document, can you please type in now everything you already know about the kulaks, or everything you can remember about collectivization? Please pause the video and empty your head now. Brilliant, thank you. So, we're going to just do a very quick recap on those two things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the definition of collectivization that you looked at last week. So you've seen this before. I'd like you to again change your font colour to green, and I'd like you to add anything that you've missed. I'll read it once, then give you the chance to fill in some gaps. So, collectivization. In order to support his plans for industrialization, Stalin needed to bring about a massive increase in the amount of grain being produced in the countryside. A reliable, consistent supply of food from the countryside would ensure that urban workers in the cities were fed, and that surplus grain could be sold abroad to raise more money for industrialization. More efficient farming methods would also release peasants to work in the new factories. Stalin's answer was collectivization of farms. To him, this would not only result in more grain, but would also see a truly socialist system finally installed. Stalin himself called this policy the Second Revolution. In 1929, he announced that collectivization would become compulsory. And the entire idea was that small landholdings of individual peasant farmers would be grouped together to form these collectives. Pause the video and add anything you've missed in green. Excellent. Right, let's quickly recap kulaks. So kulaks were the group of people who Stalin persecuted as part of his collectivization drive. And when we learn more about persecution over the next few weeks and months, you'll hear this word kulaks used an awful lot. So again, we'll read the definition that you've looked at already. Again, in green, can you add anything you've missed in your what do you already know box? As part of the collectivization drive, Stalin identified a clear class enemy of the people in the countryside, known as the kulaks. A kulak was a farmer who was richer than the general peasantry with more land and animals. The kulaks were most likely to resist the process of collectivization because they wanted to keep control of their own profitable farms. Therefore, by identifying them as an enemy of the state, the consequences would help Stalin bring about forcing the farmers to fall in line. From December 1929, Stalin announced the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, where he directed the OGPU to persecute the kulaks directly. He stormed villages and rounded up huge numbers of so-called kulaks who were either shot or deported. Again, please pause the video now and fill in anything you've missed in green. Fantastic. So, with that recap and with those ideas that, like I say, you've heard before, we're going to start today in this lesson. It's just going to be me giving you an introduction to the wider question. I'm going to talk through the basics of these 3 steps. At the end, you've got a short summary task. And then going forward, especially after Easter, we're going to start to move on to the analysis. And this will be the first essay you write about the Russian Revolution as part of your remote learning. So just as last week, I'd like you to take notes as I talk you through these things. You've got the boxes in the Google Sheets document to do that in, or if you'd rather print them out or do it online paper and take a picture at the end, that's brilliant. But that question that we're focused on today one more time is how successful was Stalin's policy of forced collectivization 29 to 41? I'm going to talk to you about the stages of collectivization. We're then going to talk about the impact of collectivization, and then you're going to do those summaries of the information yourself. So please get ready to start taking your notes. I'm going to start by telling you about the reasons for forced collectivization, or Stalin's initial attempts to do that. So, as part of the Great Turn, from 1928, Stalin committed to collective farming. That idea that individual landholdings would be grouped together and the farming would be done collectively. The hope was that the peasant farmers would be able to produce more food this way, and they'd be able to do it with less people. If they could produce more food, that was brilliant. It meant more food could be taken to the urban city centres, and then that food could allow that industrialisation to happen in the cities. But also, if the farming could be done with less people, it meant people could also then move to the cities and work in the industrialised factories as well. So the hope was that revolutionising agriculture would help with the revolution of the industry. Now, the hope at the Great Turn was that this could be done voluntarily. And as you can see at the bottom, there was a large propaganda drive that tried to persuade people to join these collectives. But many of the peasants chose not to, preferring to keep a hold of owning their own land and controlling the things produced on their own land. So this propaganda and this voluntary collectivization failed. Now, Stalin chose to blame the kulaks for this. Those wealthier landowners who he portrayed as being greedy and wanted to keep a hold of their land so they could keep their wealth themselves. So because of the failure of voluntary collectivization, Stalin had to move to a system of forced collectivization. And he did this from 1929. Now, the early stages of forced collectivization involved Stalin doing a few different things to reorganize and ensure collectivization would take root. First of all, he organized a new campaign of government procurement. Now, procurement means the action of obtaining something. So what this meant in practice was the government increased the amount they were going to procure from the farmers. They were setting higher and higher quotas of what they wanted the farmers to give to them. Basically, a large amount of the food produced by the farmers had to then be given to the government, who they would use to feed the industry workers in the cities. Now, the second part of the early stages of forced collectivization was scaling up the anti-kulak propaganda. And much of this can be viewed as an attempt at divide and rule, splitting the kulaks from the peasant class, and trying to persuade the peasant class to hate the kulaks, trying to persuade the peasants to join in on that persecution, as seeing the kulaks as greedy. Now, Stalin said when this drive began that he wanted to completely liquidate the kulaks as a class. He wanted to completely get rid of them. So he organised for the OGPU to execute many of the kulaks. The OGPU were often given quotas for how many kulaks they had to execute. They also deported the kulaks to work camps in remote places like Siberia. And the fear that this caused many of the kulaks to have actually caused many of them to destroy their own land. Many kulaks chose to kill their own livestock, kill their own like cows and pigs, to burn down their own crop so that they wouldn't be seen as wealthy and they wouldn't be persecuted by the OGPU. So actually this drive for collectivization in many ways harmed the food production by killing that livestock or destroying that farmland. Stalin also increased the drive for forced collectivization. After 1929, peasants started to be forced to join collectives, again being forced by the OGPU. Now this forced collectivization moved at quite a rapid pace. By 1930, 25% of all grain farming had already been collectivized. By 1930 as well, a total of 58% of peasant households had been collectivized. So in less than 2 years, more than half of the peasant households had been collectivized. Now this rapid pace actually went too quick. That rapid pace was actually causing, in many ways, too much destruction. And Stalin recognised this himself. He said that his party members who had been pushing collectivization, or the workers within the state, those party members, had become dizzy with success. And it had gone too quick and caused too much upheaval. So in late 1929 and early 1930, Stalin actually slowed down collectivization. He returned back to voluntary collectivization. And this was done so that there wasn't too much disruption while the harvests of 1930 were collected. Now, at this point, collectivization actually fell to only about 20% of households. So you have the initial rise to 58%, a fall by October 1930 to 20% of households collectivized. However, this drop was only temporary, because by the mid to late 1930s, and by especially the spring of 1931, there was a return to forced collectivization. Once that crop had been collected and harvested, Stalin returned to a policy that he saw as being the best way to industrialize the Soviet Union. And this bit stuck. It was established. And by 1941, 100% of households became collectivized. Now, the way this was done was two forms of collective farms. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is the kolkhov. And you've got the spelling of kolkhov just on the screen there. Now, the kolkhov was the typical or most common collective farm under collectivization. The way it worked is it combined those individual farms together in a cooperative structure. Usually the collective kolkhov was based around a single village, and the peasants mainly stayed living in the houses that they'd lived in before. They'd have their own plot of land to work on, and the kolkhov would on average be made up by about 75 families. Now, creating these kolkhovs was not an easy job to do. The changes to land ownership had to be mapped out, and changes needed to be made to the farming infrastructure. Now, the way it was organised is each kolkhov, each community, was organised by a member of the Communist Party. Now, this chairman of the kolkhov had the responsibility to organise how the kolkhov would work. Now, each kolkhov was then set a quota from the central party, or the central government, and the quotas of the amount of crops they had to produce and give to the government were often very, very high. Usually about 40% of their crops every single year had to be given to the government. Now, the remaining 60% had to be used to feed the people living on the kolkhov. If there was ever any left after that, then that could be sold, but that was very, very rare. Now, the 40% that was part of government procurement, part of those quotas, were sold to the government very, very cheaply. The government did not pay a high price for it. So it was in many ways a quite harsh deal on the farmers in the kolkhovs. Workers on the kolkhovs were also banned from moving around the Soviet Union. And an internal system of passports, you can see a picture of one of them on the screen there, an internal system of passports were used to restrict the movement of those peasants. As you can imagine, this was something that in many ways was very, very unpopular in the peasant class. Not only had they had their land taken away from them and made into a collective, but also then their freedom to move had been taken, even within the Soviet Union. Now, the kolkhov was, like I say, one way that collectivisation was organised. The second way they were organised was through sovkhozs. Now, a sovkhoz was a similar idea with a slightly different organisation. These were not collectives run by a party chairman taken from land owned by the peasant class, like the kolkhovs were. A sovkhoz was made up on land which had been confiscated by the government. So when land was taken away from the old bourgeoisie, it was often transformed into this sovkhoz. So the land was owned by the government here. Now, the labourers who worked on a sovkhoz were classed as workers. They weren't peasants. They were usually larger than the kolkhovs. And the farmers who worked there, because they'd been relocated, because the land had been confiscated, the workers there had been relocated to that land from other parts of the Soviet Union. They'd been moved to work on a sovkhoz. And the hardline communists, the purists, they thought that the sovkhoz was the ideal for how collectivisation should be run. And there was very much a view in the Soviet Union that eventually all the collective farms would be sovkhoz, that the kolkhovs would eventually transform or transition into being sovkhoz, because that was seen as being the ideal way to organise socialist agriculture. Now, the other way that collectivisation tried to drive improvements to agriculture was through trying to modernise it, trying to update the agriculture so that it used more modern and more productive and more efficient techniques. Now, to do this, things called machine tractor stations were created all over the Soviet Union. Now, what these would do is they take very much a lead on modernising agriculture and farming. Now, what they would do is the machine tractor stations would offer machinery, things like tractors and other forms of industrial agricultural techniques, and they'd offer them to the sovkhoz and the kolkhovs. They would also offer seeds to support them. They would often be a centre for experts as well, and those experts at the machine tractor stations would give advice to the farms in the surrounding area, helping them to be more productive in their farming. So there would be things like agronomists who would give advice about the soil and keeping it fertile and productive. There would be veterinary surgeons who would help give advice on the livestock. There would be surveyors who would give advice on the land. And there'd be technicians who would keep the machinery, like the tractors, up to date and working. It was hoped that these machine tractor stations would help the agriculture become more productive. Therefore, the more work that was done by machines, the less people that would be needed in the rural areas, and the more people who could then be relocated to the cities to do the industrialisation work in factories. Now, these machine tractor stations often gave more help to the sovkhols than they did to the kolkhols. And they did this because of the idea that the sovkhols were the ideal way to organise socialist farming. So they very much wanted to make them look more effective to help justify an eventual drive to eliminating kolkhovs as well. Now, the machine tractor stations did increase the amount of work done by machines, and they were quite effective in some regards at modernising those methods. However, not all of those benefits were fully reached, and the Soviet Union infrastructure still continued to struggle through things like a lack of lorries, which meant they couldn't then transport the goods from the rural areas where they were grown. So there were big impacts and positives about the tractor stations, but they certainly were not perfect. Now, as we mentioned earlier, in order for this system of collectivisation to work, it involved taking land away from the peasants and taking wealth away from the people classed as kulaks. So there was quite a lot of opposition to forced collectivisation. Voluntary collectivisation didn't work because people didn't choose it. So when they were forced to join it, there was often people who were very, very unhappy. Now, a lot of this opposition was kind of centred in the more fertile areas like Ukraine, but the opposition was spread throughout the rural areas. Now, in response to that early opposition, Stalin did use his armed forces to brutally, in some cases, end opposition. There are stories where entire villages are burnt by the OGPU in order to end opposition. Any peasant who fought back against the system of collectivisation was viewed as being a class enemy by the party. They'd be viewed as being a kulak, and if you opposed collectivisation, you'd be deported to work in a labour camp, a gulag, in areas like Siberia. Now, this harmed in many ways the goals that Stalin was trying to move towards. The process of dekulakization, the process of deporting or killing those who had been successful farmers, meant that many of the farms got worse at producing food. Those people who knew what they were doing and had therefore become successful were then kulaks, so they were deported away. Now, this, as you can imagine, this drop in production causes a drop in the amount of food people have access to. It's thought that this forced collectivisation caused around 10 million people to die in the Soviet Union. And that's a combination of those killed in the resistance, but also caused by the drop in food production. 10 million, an absolutely huge number of deaths. In total, by about 1939, around 19 million peasants had migrated. And this left the people in the collectives feeling betrayed by Stalin's regime. And even on those collectives, those people who stayed, in times of hardship, if they did anything like stealing food for themselves, the punishments were incredibly, incredibly cruel. Life was extremely harsh for those people on the collectives for much of the time. This leading to the 1932 to 34 famine. The famine started in Ukraine, but it did spread to parts throughout the Soviet Union and Russia. This famine between 32 and 34 is seen as being one of the worst in Russian history. And much of it was caused by the government's procurement. Because when there were those initial problems in food production, the government did not lower their procurement quotas. So collectives were making less food than before, but still giving the same amount to the government. So the people on the farms struggled to feed themselves and died in huge numbers. Now, overall, in the short term, the impact of collectivisation was really, really challenging and caused many problems throughout the Soviet Union. At first, production fell. At first, collective farms were producing less food than they were producing before. For example, it wasn't until 1935 that production increased beyond the pre-collectivisation levels. In terms of livestock, like the cows and the pigs and the animals, it wasn't until 1953 that livestock numbers increased beyond pre-collectivisation levels. And much of that was because those kulaks had killed those animals to try and protect themselves. Now, the fall in production, much of it was caused by the poor organisation, by those party members who were chairmen of the collectives. These were not people who had experience in agriculture who knew what they were doing, but they were people who were loyal to the party, and that's how they got those roles. As well as that, the machine tractor stations took an awfully long time to be able to adequately supply the Solkovs and Kolkovs with what they needed. However, eventually, the longer-term impact of collectivisation did increase. As I mentioned, eventually they did produce more than before, but it came at a great cost. And the great cost was kind of experienced by that peasant class. The peasant class which, throughout that system of collectivisation, had suffered deportations, persecution, starvation, and poverty. Now, the third benefit, or the third impact of collectivisation, was a political gain for Stalin. For the first time, the system of collectivisation had allowed him to politically control the rural areas, which had been really difficult for the Soviet Union to control before. Now, through the loyal party members who served as chairmen of the Kolkovs, they were able now to directly control the farmers. Peasants would no longer be able to resist the regime. They'd be controlled in terms of where they lived through the internal passport system. And this control that Stalin gained over the rural areas also allowed him to weaken his rivals on the right of the party. People such as Bukharin and Rykov, who in the past had opposed collectivisation, were now much, much weaker because collectivisation had become established. And this allowed Stalin to achieve his goal of eliminating class differences in the countryside as the kulaks as a class were removed. Okay, thank you very much for paying really close attention and hopefully taking notes and getting a lot of that down. I really hope these short introductions are helping you to grasp the basics before you then go and find the depth and detail as you go on. What I would like you to do now is complete the summary sentences below, underneath your notes. I'd like you to use the information you've just been through to do that. Then I'd like you to keep a hold of these notes if you've done it on paper, or make sure you've got access to them if you've done them on the computer. Because after Easter half term, this is the information we're going to be digging a little bit deeper in and preparing for you to write an essay on it as well. I've also copied in 3 stretch readings from these 3 books. You've got links to them on the document. And there are slightly more in-depth discussions about collectivisation and industrialisation and the changes that Stalin made that we've been talking about over the last week or so. Please remember to click Hand In when you've completed the work on Google Classroom so I can get in and take a read of them. And then please make sure you have a really good break and enjoy the Easter. I know it'll feel really, really weird because you've not been in school for the past couple of weeks, so in many ways it won't feel like a typical Easter break. But do make sure you take a step back from work, spend a lot of time in the garden, get a lot of fresh air. If you've got any hobbies, crack on with those. Those of you who'd like to who are still interested in this and like to spend some time reading over Easter, please drop me an email. One or two of you have already, and I've got the whole reading library for Empire and Russia in here with me during self-isolation. So if there's anything you're interested in and you'd like to kind of read through over Easter, please just let me know. I'll definitely scan some things in and email them to you so you can access. Thank you for completing your work this week and last week. Have a great Easter break, and as always, drop me any emails if you need anything, you've got any questions. Thank you very much.